there was a book that was published in Norwegian called Fru Muus's Klage by a historian in Norway named Bodil Stenseth. And I heard about this book. I had already had my interest piqued in the main characters of the story. I had been doing some research on them, and I read this and I wanted to know more. And so I reached out to the author and had the full intention of translating the book. But that didn't really work. And the reason it didn't work was because when I started translating things that she had translated from English sources, I needed to go back to the originals because I needed to see the language that was being used in the 1880s. And so through that process, I, being at St. Olaf College, had very easy access to a lot of the archives. And so I was able to find a lot of additional things that are spread out through the book. So the English language edition is not actually a translation, it's an expansion using the same method of storytelling that Bodil did so well in the Norwegian version, but it's about 22,000 words longer in the English version, and it has over 100 additional citations. So it was a very big project. We're not going to go through the whole book though, because it's a long one with a lot of things in there. I had a number of conversations with faculty members and staff members from St. Olaf, where I teach, and nobody knew about this story. And the only handful of people who knew about it were significantly older than me. And because of that, I really wanted to bring this story to an English readership. The book does not read as a quote-unquote biography. There is already a really good biography of Bernt Julius Muus, the founder of St. Olaf, and that was written many years ago, and was written by one of the professors at St. Olaf College, who is now retired, Joseph Shaw. So this was never meant to replace that book. This was meant to focus more on Bernt and Olina as a couple, and the scandal they, I won't say found themselves in, because they were very active members of actively doing that.
The significance of their stories.
Yeah, the significance, yeah. So I started translating. That translating turned into editing. The editing became a lot of work, and I had this really awesome proofreader who was doing way more work than proofreading, and then I said, hey, how about you just do a lot more work? And I finagled Torild to take a much more significant role in the project. So it has been something that we have both been actively engaged in for several years now.
So yeah, maybe it was a little insane of me to get involved in this, but working on the translation was a very collaborative process, and that was really rewarding. And for a translator, I think it helps to have a little knowledge of the subject, at least enough to know what you don't know. And I've heard some of the stories. I've been to most of the churches that are mentioned in this book. And it helps to have a curiosity about the subject, which helps to avoid making mistakes. I found myself going down many rabbit holes as I worked, however, perhaps not the most efficient process, but certainly the most rewarding.
So first we're going to tell you, introduce you to the two main characters of the story. The first being Bernt Julius Muus, who is the founder of St. Olaf College, where I teach. He came initially to the U.S. in 1859 at the age of 27, and when he arrived, he was immediately in charge of 28 congregations over 15,000 square miles. So that is about the size of Denmark. So he was the only Norwegian, only pastor from the Norwegian Synod in that huge of an area. So he had a really, really daunting task from the moment he arrived in Minnesota. He would eventually do a lot in terms of establishing other congregations and acting as the spiritual leader for quite a few congregations, both before they had their own permanent pastors, but also the pastors would travel back to Norway or, have different things that they needed to be gone for, and he would very often step in. So during his 40 years as a pastor in Minnesota, he baptized almost 10,000 individuals. He confirmed over 5,000 youth. He married 1,200 couples, and he buried almost 4,000 individuals. So he was a very, very active man who put his energy into his work. Being a professor at St. Olaf College, I can say a lot of people at the college don't really know his, that part of his life, because for us, he is known as the founder of our school.
So Olena, his wife, is the other half of this story, or maybe even more than half. When you think about Minnesota was the frontier in 1859, and the typical Norwegian immigrant at this period was rural, came from a poor background, and was coming to America to escape poverty and to gain opportunities for a better life. Now, Bernd was educated as pastor, so we already know he was not necessarily typical. But Olena also was not a typical immigrant. She came from a really privileged and wealthy background. Her father, Johan Pind, owned several farms as well as the large estate that she grew up on. He was also involved in real estate and was a local district authority. And she was the spoiled youngest child in the family. Her parents could not deny her anything. Her older sisters had married well, and she became engaged to Bernd Muus at age 19. Now, to become a pastor's wife was the most honorable position a woman could have. The duties of a pastor's wife were also more extensive and significantly more important than an ordinary wife. She had to be familiar with the scriptures and the creeds. When her husband was away, the pastor's wife had to lead confirmation instruction and help out in the congregation in addition to her other responsibilities. Olena would have to also take on all the activities of a housewife on a large farm. Everything at that time, you can imagine, from slaughtering and baking to candle making and preserving food. She had to manage the parsonage's tenants, servants, and farmhands, and she could expect to have a baby within the first year. So this was obviously something that she had not learned in her privileged childhood and youth. So even though Olena's parents sent an experienced servant girl with her on their journey to America, Olena must have been woefully unprepared for what awaited her when they arrived at their final destination in Goodhue County and found they didn't have a parsonage yet. They were guests in another family's home in a very large household. A log house with a dirt floor was where they lived for the first 6 months they were in Goodhue County.
So their story continues after they moved to Goodhue County, and Olina is taking care of the home. Bernd is off and away visiting all these other congregations, and over time, marital problems arise. And that is what is really at the heart of the quote-unquote scandal that shook Norwegian America. But the word scandal is also a little bit misleading because it's really a series of things that happen. It is not one thing. So the origin of everything, where everything begins, is that Olina files suit against her husband. She has inherited a large amount of money after her father passed away, and she believes she is the rightful inheritor. And so he will not agree to this, even though her lawyer talks to him, so she takes him to court. But then the church finds out that she went to the court and didn't settle the matter within the church. And then a whole series of church cases begin. And these cases are maybe what really sets this case apart, in that they go through disciplinary actions, they go through this long process that lasts days and days, over months and months, to find out what happened. With Bernd as one of the people who was leading the meetings or in charge of the investigative committee, and Olina never allowed to say one word. So what we thought we would do is contextualize this a little bit by reading a couple excerpts from these proceedings. So the first one is an excerpt that depicts the very first meeting the church congregation had to discuss the case.
Yes, and this meeting was ostensibly to decide whether Pastor Muus should continue as pastor in the congregation while the civil case was going on. But it soon became a matter of whether Olina Muus should be put under church discipline for not bringing up the matter before the congregation before she went to court. So it begins on February 18th, 1880. Beginning in the early morning, spectators had streamed in through Holden Church's front door to secure seats. Long before the meeting actually began, the great church on the prairie was packed full. It didn't seem to matter to the spectators that they had woken up to falling snow and difficult driving conditions, or that it was a weekday. No one wanted to miss this meeting. Nearly 1,000 people arrived, many of them curious outsiders, newspaper reporters, and others who otherwise never attended the church. Newspapers had already written about the case for a long time, both in America and in Norway. On this day, 3 Norwegian Lutheran Church congregations in Goodhue County, Minnesota, were to meet in an open congregational meeting to discuss the marriage between their pastor, Bernd Julius Muus, and Olina Muus. One of the most promising leaders of the Norwegian American community in Minnesota and founder of St. Olaf College, Pastor Muus spoke with authority. He had been active in religious debates for 2 decades. The pastor's wife, Olina Muus, was among the leading women of the rural community, a role model for the entire congregation. Now, embarrassing and personal details from the couple's life together were to be discussed thoroughly in front of everyone. What had really happened between the spouses? Could Pastor Muus continue as Holden's pastor even after charges were brought against him? And would Mrs. Muus be put under church discipline as a result of her unruly behavior? The day's events would be more entertaining than going to the theater. Holden Church had been financed by the congregation and built by a construction company from Red Wing. The building had a high ceiling, so it couldn't have been very warm in the church that February day, despite the crowd, which was a sea of men. In all the rows of pews, even on what was usually the women's side, there were men as far as the eye could see. At the front, under the altar and pulpit, sat even more men, pastors, and the church council burdened with the seriousness of the moment. Only 3 women were present, Olena Muus herself and 2 companions she'd been allowed to bring with her. In the minutes before the meeting began, there was both great excitement and uncertainty, as no one really knew what to expect. The only certain thing was that only the men would speak during the meeting. They would debate, discuss, and scrutinize the matter publicly. Of the nearly 1,000 people in the room, the main character would not be allowed to speak. Olena Muus, on whom the day's discussions would center, who had put everything in motion by submitting a written complaint against her husband to the civil court without bringing it to the congregation first, she would be silenced.
The second reading is from the third congregational meeting and really depicts the confusion that they are having.
By the time the third meeting started, the waters had been thoroughly muddied. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted to be heard. So on May 13th, 6 weeks after the second round of congregational meetings, spring plowing and planting were complete, and the farmers could with clear consciences set aside 2 days to participate in the third congregational meeting in the Muus case. Although Olena Muus asserted herself through her letters, once in Holden Church, she was to remain voiceless. And then there was a long discussion at the beginning whether they should have a closed meeting or an open meeting, and despite the Synode's desire for a committee to handle the case, the meeting had begun and wouldn't be stopped. After a majority had decided to keep the meeting open to the public, the actual deliberation could begin. Initially, Pastor Quinn stated he would start at the beginning by examining what Mrs. Muus's complaint against her husband actually contained. The meeting's purpose was to take a position on the complaint, to refute it or confirm it. The congregation shouldn't judge the matter. The goal was to find the reasons for this deep misery. But which of Mrs. Muus's complaints was the congregation to deliberate? She had offered at least 2. Immediately, this question became too much for the meeting's chair. Preuss was unable to control the assembly. Hands were constantly in the air. Pastor Muus, Pastor Bjorn, and several others repeatedly expressed and elaborated on their opinions. Chairman Preuss's attempts to sort out the confusing amount of information and viewpoints seemed hopeless. Finally, the majority concluded that the meeting had not 1, but 2 complaints from the pastor's wife to consider. In addition, Pastor Bjorn had spoken so well on Mrs. Muus's behalf during this discussion that Chairman Preuss was even more confused. Should the assembly consider Mrs. Muus or Pastor Muus as the accused? Pastor Bjorn couldn't decide that question, as each party was both accuser and accused. The majority of the congregation reached the same conclusion. Accordingly, Mrs. Muus's spokesman had won a great victory almost before the meeting began. Was Pastor Muus a Christian husband? Pastor Bjorn suggested the matter be investigated further, and the congregation agreed with him. After that, Bjorn could begin to read aloud to the congregation from the complaint, with the shocking passages about how Mrs. Muus's husband had behaved at the parsonage regarding her broken leg.
Okay, and then we have a third reading.
Yeah, the third reading took up the issue of Pastor Muus's treatment of his wife when she broke her leg. When she was brought home from Faribault where this happened and she asked for her husband to send for a doctor, it was told that Pastor Muus refused to send for the doctor immediately, saying that it was soon night and, quote, she should anoint herself with patience, end quote, until the doctor could come the next day. The question was, how should this phrase be interpreted? So when Pastor Muus had finished, Chairman Preuss requested clarification on one particular point. How might the phrase, anoint oneself with patience, be understood? The congregation immersed themselves in interpreting what he meant. Parishioner Ulla Appeland claimed the expression was common and mustn't be understood as malicious. Pastor Bjorn had previously described the expression as heartless. Now he stated that not only was the phrase vulgar, from a pastor's mouth, it was unseemly. He reminded the congregation that Mrs. Muus was willing to swear on her honor that the words were spoken as she claimed. Preuss was sympathetic. He admitted that the phrase anoint oneself with patience could be used in various circumstances. The words could be said coldly and harshly, but also in jest. Pastor Muus took the floor again, and this time he made a confession that really captured everyone's attention. In the past 2 or 3 years, he hadn't spoken to Mrs. Muus more than was absolutely necessary. He wasn't going to speculate why that might be. For the third time, he made vague insinuations about his wife. She was neither talkative nor of sound mind. It wasn't appropriate for him to explain why. However, he couldn't recall using the phrase anoint oneself with patience, but if Mrs. Muus swore that he had said it, he wouldn't object. He also couldn't remember Mrs. Muus asking for messengers to be sent to Cannon Falls or Zumbrota. He returned to a previous point. Was there any truth in a person like Helena Muus? An honorable person would have been ashamed to bring such a scandal down upon their house as she had. However, the meeting chair didn't give up the pursuit for a common understanding of the disputed words. Pastor Quinn took the floor to interpret the phrase with the best intentions, and in doing so, for the first time during the meeting, he defended Pastor Muus. Quinn could imagine how, under similar circumstances, he might have comforted his wife with these words spoken in loving jest. He even showed the congregation with gestures and body language how he might have said as much in a loving, playful manner while he stroked Pastor Preuss, who was sitting in front of him, on the head. It was theatrical, but when a member of the audience began to applaud, Korn reprimanded him sharply. According to Budstikken, that's the Norwegian American newspaper, the man had clapped his hands in admiration of the performance. Time after time, Chairman Preuss tried to conclude and get the congregation to determine whether Pastor Muus had sinned and neglected his wife, or whether Mrs. Muus had sinned and made false accusations, but there was no end to the discussion. When Pastor Bjorn, on behalf of Mrs. Muus, declared that he wished to present a new piece of evidence in the case, the chairman was forced into yet another round. First, Pastor Bjorn gave a little moralizing recommendation to Pastor Muus. It would be an infinite blessing to Pastor Muus, his household, and the wider community if this matter could teach him to watch his mouth. Pastor Muus's greatest downfall was that he constantly spoke heartlessly.
So while all this is going on, it is the beginning years of St. Olaf College. So the case started in 1879, the series of cases, and went to 1883. St. Olaf College was founded in 1874, but only after a series of discussions and what is known as the common school controversy. And I think essentially the question, the point that people were debating at the time was, how should we educate our youth? Should it be through private religious schooling, or should it be from public schooling? And for those of you who are familiar with St. Olaf, it probably wouldn't surprise you that Barnt Julius Muus supported schooling that was religious. So we are going to read another excerpt from 67.
Yep. Okay, so this controversy that was played out, and Muus was speaking in rebuttal to the public school side. Another of Muus's rebuttals was printed on May 12, 1870 in the Red Wing Argus, where he wrote, quote, "I consider the common school an institution which according to its principles must work against the kingdom of God, and furthermore, I consider it a poorly arranged institution because the children learn there far less than they could and ought to learn." The editor of the Red Wing Argus decided it was necessary to preface his letter with an editorial titled, "Education or Propagandism."
So we really see at this time that public schools and the support of public schools are really central for a lot of people's view on what it means to be an American and what it means to have a democracy. And so we see Barnt really labeled as anti-American as well.
Yeah, so many of the churches in Goodhue and Rice counties still show their original Norwegian roots with their names. Gol, Hegre, Vang, Urland, Trondheim, Solør. The immigrants clung to the Norwegian language in the belief that the mother tongue is the language of the heart, and that children could only understand the Lutheran doctrine if they were taught in their parents' native language. They would become ungodly if they were taught in English. And just as an example of how much of a stronghold the Norwegian language had in the church. Now, Bernt Muus went back to Norway in 1899. So, in Denison Vang congregation, which was a daughter congregation to Pastor Muus's Holden Church, Norwegian was the language of the church used for meetings and services for almost 70 years. And it wasn't until 1928, long after Muus had gone, that the congregation finally voted to have 4 English services per year. In 1931, they voted to have half the yearly services in Norwegian and half the services in English. And prior to 1932, Vang held parochial school in Vang's district in Norwegian, with instruction in Bible reading, grammar, reading, dictation, and music. And I know that young people were being confirmed in Norwegian up until at least the mid-1930s. So by 1944, Pastor Egge held only 1 Norwegian service, and Pastor Blikstad only had an occasional service. The change from Norwegian to English in the church was often painful and controversial. And there's an old joke about a parishioner who was opposed to this change when it came up in their congregation, who claimed, if Norwegian was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. Okay, oh yeah. So, how the Muus case became of interest to fights for women's rights. Now, in the U.S., the women's rights movement began in the late 1840s. And, of course, Olena was out in the territory. So it doesn't seem that when Olena sued her husband for her inheritance that she was thinking beyond her personal situation. However, it soon became an issue of national and international interest. And part of this was because when she sued for her inheritance, Norwegian law still held that the men in the family had all of the financial power. and that women did not. Whereas in Minnesota, in the US, laws have been passed that allowed women to control their own property and assets. So at this time in history, liberals in Scandinavia saw America as the land of emancipated women. And until women received the vote in 1920, perhaps the most important legal reform in the U.S. was that they had their control over managing any assets they brought to the marriage or received later. And this was an important factor in the Muus case. Women also on the East Coast thought that the women in the West were very tough and independent, so they were very interested in what was happening out on the prairie. But within the church, Christian orthodoxy was the same whether in the German, Norwegian, or American church. A woman's place was in the house as wife and mother. The husband was the master, and women were as servants or as slaves, subservient to the master. And there was a Norwegian feminist who was touring the U.S. and was writing articles both for papers in Norway and a women's magazine called Women's Journal, which was the mouthpiece of the radical faction of the women's movement. And it was published, Norwegians in the Northwest, letter from Mrs. Torild Homstad, printed on July 30th, 1881, wasn't uplifting. The entire article centered on Pastor Muus and the Norwegian Synod. With or against her will, Olena Muus became the face for women's rights, the rights of American women. First, Homstad declared that the Norwegian Synod consists of very zealous adherents of slavery, and now that black slavery is abolished, they try with all their power to keep up the white slavery. In congregational meetings, the clergy proclaimed that a wife shall be a slave to her husband. Homstad also stated, and it was pure imagination, that the same pastors had previously declared that a father had the right to punish his children with death. Although the death penalty had been outlawed, the pastors were still fervent supporters of slavery. The slavery of the wife is their favorite idea. Homstad went further to state that the Synod considered themselves to be the only true and pure Christians in the world. In this Norwegian American Synod, continued Homstad, Pastor Muus is one of the most prominent and powerful rulers and chiefs.
Okay, so these are some of the things that are a big piece of this story. I think what drew me initially to this book was the way in which it's not just a story about a single couple and their marriage that ended in a scandal, but that it weaves in so many other elements of identity and of so many other stories of prominent Norwegians in the Minnesota community. And that was one of the things that I think was really apparent to Bodil when she first started doing her research. She did not intend to write this story. She actually first sought to write a story about 12 immigrants to the U.S. And when she started writing, she realized that they were all connected to the Muus case because everyone at the time had taken a side. And so it weaves together so many different elements of this immigrant community and really defines what it means to be accepted by your community, to be American, to be labeled as anti-American, and it really shows and illustrates what it meant at the time to be a part of that Norwegian American community.
So I'd like to say a few words about what I consider to be the legacies of Bernd Julius and Olina Muus. And clearly, as Kari has said, Pastor Muus played an enormous role in creating and building Lutheran congregations in the Midwest. But paradoxically, he was a stern, authoritarian pastor, often characterized as a domestic tyrant. But yet, he advocated for women's education and founded an educational institution on the basis of educating women as well as men at a time when that was still not common. It seems to me that, at least for me, is his most important legacy. The book begins with an epigraph concerning Olina Muus from the Pioneer Press, January 26, 1880, and I'm quoting, "Her complaint is at present a psychological enigma, which may or may not be solved at some future time." In the year plus living with Olina and Bernd Julius Muus while working on this translation with Kari, I kept hoping that I would come to some clear understanding of who Olina Muus really was. Clearly, the strong will she demonstrated as a youth helped her through many difficult times, but how did she sustain the faith that brought her to fall in love with Bernd when she was betrayed by her own church and her own congregation? So she still remains somewhat of an enigma to me. I hope that if some reader comes to a conclusion, they'll let me know.
And I think we will end there and open it for questions.
Did she want to marry him?
Yes.
Yes, and there are early letters between the two that are used as sources in the book, and they profess deep love and admiration for each other. It's a very two-sided, yeah.
And when she broke
Courtship.
her leg, was that was like not part, like that's way before this suit came about? Or it was like yet another, it's just like when she was,
The
when they were in
chariot.
court, she'd say, yet another example of this was when
Yes.
he said blah, 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 blah.
Exactly,
Oh.
exactly, yeah.
I
Yes.
read the book through it last week. I appreciate the short chapters. It makes it easy to read a couple and then put it down without having to find it in the middle of the columns. So that was one comment, and then I was wondering I read it, I had to read it to the end because I wanted to know the result. But what did you leave out? I mean, it's very thorough. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying you left it, but there must have been a few things.
Yeah, there was actually. In terms of what I translated the whole book that Boedel had written, and then I did quite a bit of my own research, and some of that was taken out during the editing process because it felt too focused on St. Olaf's story. So I am working on a continuation that brings that together later. So there are some things connected to St. Olaf that didn't end up in the final book.
Well,
But-
good job.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm a little curious about what you found in the archive about citizenship and their ideas of women's land rights in a sense that you were talking about before. But did Olina ever mention the married women's property rights or odelsrecht or anything about their connection? Because I know also, if I'm correct, they didn't become citizens for a very long time, and they intentionally avoided
Ever.
it. Yeah, so because they weren't citizens, Bernd didn't really feel like he had to abide by American laws, correct? And yet Olina chose to kind of use them in her favor. And so I'm curious what you found in the archives talking about those two perspectives.
Oh, I guess I should let you answer that question, but I'll say something about it first. First of all, it was the lawyer, Andreas Juland, who was also married to a very prominent women's rights person, Clara Juland. And he was the one who really pushed that argument through the courts whether they should follow American law or Norwegian law.
Yeah, I have never seen in anything that Olina wrote, which was all in Norwegian. Well, a weird mix of Norwegian, Danish, and a little Swedish. I have never seen the word odelsrett. So the right to inheritance is basically how that is defined, and also no reference to right of property. And I think that might be connected to the fact that they lived at the parsonage, so they didn't have their own family land in the same way. That land and house was owned by the church until very recently. So that might have had something to do with it.
So, how did the Haugians in North America view this dispute?
I would say not just the Haugianere, but all of the other Lutheran factions thought it was laughable, could not understand why there was such a big dispute, but at the same time, it wasn't really handled all that differently than other. So, for example, you have more progressive Norwegians coming over who are not members of the Norwegian Lutheran Synod, and they're making fun of it too. So it's not just one group, one faction that's making it into a thing. Do you wanna?
Well, the Norwegian Synod was the largest of the synod. I think there were about 5 Norwegian synods at that time, and gradually they all became folded into one, but that was much later. And so they had many disagreements. They had disagreements about many things, and some of them are in this book. But I think that other Norwegian Lutherans felt that this was kind of a shameful kind of thing to bring out, and that they blamed Muus and the Norwegian Synod for kind of not necessarily letting it happen, but not handling it in a better way.
My father grew up in a Haugian household, spoke Norwegian until he went to elementary school. 4 miles away, my mother grew up in a synod, and my grandmother never allowed her to speak Norwegian.
Yeah, there are, is it Aspeland? That's the
Aspeland, yeah.
Aspeland. There's a Haugian church within,
Not very far away.
yeah, not far at all from Holden. And that relationship is also discussed a little bit in the book, because certain people that they are connected with decide to go to that church instead, and they're, seen as traitors to a certain extent. They still are. Said by a Lutheran pastor.
Were other northern European countries similar in their views to Norway in terms of property ownership, or was that atypical? Do you know? Or?
That I don't know. That's a good question.
I think throughout Europe at this time, the men controlled the finances. I think that was pretty much legal, at least in Europe. And that was one reason the liberal movements in Scandinavia admired the US so much, is that women then were allowed to own property and handle their own assets and finances on their own.
The one big difference I can think of that's not connected to ownership of property or money, but how things went differently for the different groups that came over, the Norwegians were very, very active in establishing schools with Norwegian, whereas the Danes and the Swedes primarily attended English language schools, or they had schools that were for their community, and it was more integrated. So the Norwegians were far more stubborn when it came to preserving heritage and language. Maybe still are.
One more question?
Yeah.
Did Alina and Brent Barnes, did they ever have any regrets about how this all became such a big deal? Or just how did they feel about, like at the end of it all, how did they feel about this whole scandal?
Well, I would say, well, first and foremost, Olina lives a much longer life, so she has more time to reflect back on that and write on that. And she does write some very public letters that are published, and she points out her shortcomings and acknowledges those. We never see any acknowledgement of anything from Barnt, and I do think there is something with the fact that he died much, much younger, but I also think he wasn't open to that self-reflection in the same way that she was genuinely open to it.
How did the children do with it all?
Not well.
The children's stories were tragic. They had very, very difficult experiences. And that was one of the things that I decided I really wanted to add to the book. And so that's one of the things that wasn't in the original Norwegian, but because it's, you know, those ancestors, those individuals who stayed here for the most part, not all of them, I wanted to, you know, honor what they had really lived through and experienced and how that impacted the rest of their lives. So there is a chapter on that at the very end.
Comment and question, howdy stuff. We have documentation somewhere in our family. We're knitters, and somewhere in our family there's documentation of howdy visiting my great-grandparents and knitting by the window and then preaching on a big flat rock in the forest somewhere, which is now long and gone and covered over. Just had to say that. I find it I haven't read the book yet, very excited to do so, so maybe this question will be answered. I find it very interesting, this issue, excuse me, bad cold, of trying to decide which country's laws will rule here. Because is it correct that it was a court in the state of Minnesota, officials from here, not people who came over from Norway to adjudicate in any way, other than the church people, but the legal aspect was people here. And I find it very interesting, and maybe this is the earlier years in our country, but thinking of it now, the idea that, oh, let's have a legal case now and take the laws of such and such country X, Y, Z instead of this one, I mean, that seems preposterous now.
Yep.
So what is there discussion of precedent or now, you know, things that have come from that? I think it's just a really interesting thing in how law functions. I'm not a legal person, but how precedents get set and behavior comes about. Was that common at the time? If someone from Germany had a dispute, they're like, which laws are we gonna use? Oh, let's take Germany.
No, and I think that was part of the reason why there was such interest in the case, was precisely that. These are, you know, members of the community that have a very high standing, they're very active, and the one believes they have one direction to go with the law, the other believes they have the other direction. So it started out in county court. Neither were happy with the initial outcome, so it went to the Minnesota State Supreme Court. that one, and then there was another case, that, happened as well, but I don't wanna give too many spoilers.
Yeah, and what was groundbreaking about this course was the decision, was it a Norwegian law that should be applied because the inheritance was from Norway, or was it American law that should apply? And the law that and Euland was very careful not to say publicly that both Olena and Bernd were still Norwegian citizens, because that could have really thrown a monkey wrench in the works.
Meaning that they might not have the protections of the laws of the United States that
Right,
citizens would have, so
right.
they didn't have standing or
Right.
something.
But it did, American law did prevail.
Interesting.
All right, you guys wanna sell some books? Alright, thank you all. Thank you. Alright, so we're gonna take a minute to go up to the front and, look forward to seeing you all there.
It's not collection short stories.
Yes. Ran across the street. I can say I've never heard that.
Students love stickers, so that would be
Ah,
very
gotcha.
appropriate.